James Meadway is a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, and he's been highly critical of the way policymakers have handled the crisis in the Eurozone. He also says that austerity is counterproductive. So, was last week's announcement by the ECB that they'll intervene more widely in the sovereign debt market a significant moment, or was it, as he might say, just another fudge?
It's a little bit better than another fudge. I mean, you've seen the reaction over the last week, particularly from the bond markets themselves, from traders, from other people concerned with this. Everybody except basically the Bundesbank and certain parts of the German government have been very happy about this. And it's lasted a little bit longer than previous efforts by the ECB and others to sort of try and tide over the huge problems that are there in the Eurozone. So it's a bit better than that. It's a bit more significant than that. But it still doesn't deal with the fundamentals. The fundamentals are still as bad as they have been now for the last 3 years or more, really, which is banks stuffed full of bad debt, countries who are increasingly inching towards default or threatening to default, increasingly looking like very, very bad risks, and the ECB can sit there and basically print money and flood liquidity into the system all it likes, but it doesn't deal with the problem of bad debt and the problem of failing banks.
Yeah, so you're implying that the final solution doesn't come from the ECB, that it's down to each nation state to sort themselves out?
Most likely that's what's going to happen anyway. I mean, the EU has always been this rather unusual, unique really in history setup in which there's a group of countries that retain their own sovereignty. They're still independent nations. They don't decide to pool their sovereignty. This doesn't create a United States of Europe, but it does create a series of transnational institutions, of which the ECB is an immensely important one. Now, that institution has some of the features of a central bank, but critically it doesn't have behind it a single sovereign state. It doesn't have behind it a state that can guarantee what it's doing on the basis of the taxes it receives and the revenues it will spend. Because it doesn't have that, it's always in a kind of politically risky position, and really it would only take one or two or maybe more countries really deciding that they can't tolerate this situation any longer for the whole thing to suddenly start to unravel very rapidly. Now, that could come by accident. That could come by, for instance, Greece leaving the Eurozone, and then suddenly the whole thing starts to look very, very rickety indeed.
You've also been critical of austerity, saying it's counterproductive. If we take Spain as an example, it's a country with almost 25% unemployment. Where on earth do you start with a situation like that if austerity isn't working there? Well,
the issue you've got in Spain is a very bad combination of factors, but probably not as bad as Greece, but differently bad to what Greece has had for the last few years, which is an economy that underneath all of this is not in a particularly good state anyway. I mean, for the 10 years that the Eurozone was there, a lot of deep underlying problems in Europe were glossed over, particularly in southern Europe. Now, productivity growth was not that bad. Headline growth, GDP growth was not that bad, but at the same time, this is fueled by debt. It's fueled on the back of massive trade imbalances, particularly in northern Europe. Deep structural problems that Spain does have aren't particularly addressed. These aren't particularly weak economies. They're not, developing countries, but there are deep structural problems there. So those are some of the things that are coming out. If you're talking about the immediate situation in Spain, the problems it faces are first a banking system that now looks incredibly rickety on the back of a property boom that is no longer there, a series of banks that are far too small that are now turning into a series of larger banks through forced mergers and all the rest of it, and then a government that is now itself looking at an economy that's disappearing away in front of it, that isn't pulling in the tax revenues. So there's a series of problems. Now, what you'd want to do to get out of it, I think, would start to look like ending austerity as a first port of call. It just doesn't make sense when you're in an economy with a recession this bad to say our most important priority is to try and cut government spending. What you're actually doing is just sucking demand, sucking activity out of the economy. So your first one is to do that. The second one is to try and deal with the issue of the bad banks and the bad debt sitting in those banks there. Now, I think that would probably involve some process of default or write-off of debt, whether that's debt held by mortgage holders, for instance, property owners in Spain, that you simply say we're going to have to declare an amnesty in this. This, of course, will will put the banks themselves in a very bad position. So you'll be looking also, I think, at nationalising the banks. Now, whether any of this is really compatible with remaining inside the euro is something of a moot point. It is probably better at this point to Spain to be considering leaving the euro than it is for Spain to be carrying on inside. It's not as clear-cut as Greece. Greece, I don't think there's any real logic for Greece to remain inside the euro, but Spain, I think, is increasingly heading in that direction.
In either scenario, if Spain does decide that it wants to end austerity and spend more as a government, it needs to get the money from somewhere. And as things stand, there's no way they can ask for a loan from the European Union to increase spending, because Germany's not going to stand for it, are they?
Yeah, it's very, very hard to say we'll just stump up the cash with the borrowing costs it faces and the rest of it. My own preference would be to say that, well, there are other ways for governments to raise money. The most obvious one is taxation. And if you look, Spain, like the rest of the Eurozone, in fact much of the rest of the developed world over the last few years, has seen an incredible concentration of wealth in the hands at the very top of society. So you'd want to say, well, look, it is time to pay something back into society. This is a dire situation. Clearly in Britain we've had a conversation opened up about a wealth tax here that Nick Clegg has at least floated the idea, and something like a one-off wealth tax would make sense, at least as a kind of kickstart for the economy there. So that would be one option. The other option, of course, is that if you leave the Eurozone, of course there's serious dislocation, and I don't think the situation in Spain has got bad enough that anyone would propose doing this as a sort of political solution to the situation that's developed there. But as soon as you regain control over your own currency, life becomes a lot easier, at least in the short term, as far as being able to issue loans and borrow on the part of the government. Now, that's what you would need to do. The situation you're in is bad enough that you'd have to say it needs a kick, it needs some injection of demand into the economy.
Obviously, you would like to see a change in policy in Europe, in the UK. Do you think we're any closer to seeing it?
It's an interesting question. I think we're inching towards a change. Now, the problem we've got is that the situation is bad and worsening in the UK, but more dramatically in Southern Europe, I think, at the moment. That it needs more than just inching towards a change. It needs quite a dramatic break in what's happening. I'm not certain that with the political institutions that we have, with the political parties in power that we have, that break will actually happen. So we'll have to see. It may well be the case that things will get worse before a change in policy really starts to come through, a serious change, and that would mean a reversal of, for instance, in the Eurozone, of austerity, a turn towards saying, well, actually, government does need to spend, it does need to invest to promote growth, to give people jobs, to do the things that we want to see the economy doing, and that would be a complete reverse of the current policy inside the Eurozone.